we're so happy to have you. And Wendy just said how busy you are. We appreciate your time. And I'm going to go ahead and give it to you, Mark, our extension botanist. And I'm just going to give it to you right now.
Okie doke. Thank you, Lisa.
I'm so sorry. Thank you.
No worries. Okay, everyone. Hopefully you can see the screen and you can see me. This technology is kind of a brave new world for all of us. But my topic today is plant fragrance, creating a Florida odorscape. And this concept of an odorscape I encountered from an article that was published in 2019, which defined an odorscape as an ensemble of volatile organic chemicals that constitute the sensory space of a particular insect species. And so I started thinking about this term odorscape, and I thought, well, if you can have a foodscape in your garden, or a xeriscape, a dry garden, or a naturescape, or in the aquarium trade, they often talk about cultivating an aquascape, why can't you have an odorscape? So I have co-opted this term from the ecological literature so that I think of odorscaping as the purposeful design of a garden landscape to maximize olfactory pleasure. So let's talk some about plant fragrance, where it comes from, and the science of plant fragrance. I'm sure I'm not telling you gardeners anything new that fragrance and sound are really these fabulous invisible dividends in our gardens. So we design for color, for form, for texture, to be environmentally friendly, to benefit wildlife and pollinators, but fragrance and the sound that plants make are really these extra dividends to those plants that we put in. Fragrance perception is a very individual thing. So something that smells great to me may smell horrible to you. You've all heard that term that one man's trash is another man's treasure. And so you can just think that that also applies when it comes to smell. Also, fragrance is really strongly tied to emotions, so they may be calming or energizing, and they're also tied to our memories. So for example, I grew up in Georgia with a home that had a great big tree-formed banana shrub, and when I was a little boy, 6 or 7, I would step outside my mom's kitchen door and climb in that tree, and they practically had to lure me out of the tree to come indoors for dinner. And to this day, when I smell banana shrub, it still makes me think about those days when I was a little boy. And the other thing that I know you guys have experienced is that smell is strongly connected to our sense of taste. So if you've got a cold and your sense of smell is altered, it will affect your taste. A lot of people have experienced this, unfortunately, with COVID. So emotions, memory, and taste are all connected with fragrance. And also, lastly, plant aromatic compounds, the compounds that give plants their fragrance, form the foundation of aromatherapy, which is the use of essential oils for therapeutic purposes. And I have to say, when it comes to aromatherapy, it's a little controversial. So the medical people say that there's not really good evidence for the use of essential oils to treat physical conditions, but certainly they are used to treat mental health and behavioral types of issues. So why do plants produce aromatic compounds? The thing I think that we most associate aromatic compounds with are attracting pollinators. So you have flowers that smell good to draw in pollinating insects. However, We know that once those pollinators arrive, that they're usually going after nectar or pollen as a reward, but sometimes the fragrance compounds themselves can also serve as a reward. So in this bee that you see illustrated here on the slide, this is a type of bee called a euglossine or orchid bee. And the male euglossine bees collect fragrances from flowers. They have oil-based compounds that they secrete through their lips to pick up the fragrance compounds from the flowers, and then they carry them in little pockets on their hind legs, and then they use the fragrance compounds that they've collected from flowers and from other sources, including fungi, decaying things, and they construct these elaborate perfumes that then they use in mating displays. So many males congregate together and compete to attract females, and these fragrances, these perfumes that they construct in part from plant floral fragrances, are used in the mating displays. Now, in addition to forming attractants in flowers, plant aromatic compounds can occur in leaves, stems, and roots. And in this case, they deter herbivores. So those are things that want to munch on the plant. They can slow or spread the stop of microbes. They can signal predatory insects when the plant is under attack. So it's basically like a help call, so that when a bad insect is moving in and chewing on the plant can send out compounds in the air that will let the predators know to move in. And also, interestingly, these aromatic compounds can influence the behavior of other plants nearby. And we'll talk about this a little more in the future. Now, in fruit, aromatic compounds have two purposes. When the fruit are unripe, aromatic compounds can discourage insects or other herbivores from chewing on the fruit. And conversely, when the fruit are ripe, then it can exude aromatic compounds that are actually attractants, which then attract animals to consume the fruit and thereby disperse the seeds. Now, the primary component of what we perceive as plant fragrances are called volatile organic compounds, also known as VOCs. That term volatile means that these compounds evaporate readily at room temperature. They don't have to be at a very high temperature like boiling temperature, just at ambient temperature. They can easily go from a liquid state into a gas state in the air. Now, these VOCs are also lipophilic, which means they're fat soluble. They're generally not water soluble. And this plays an important role in the extraction of plant organic compounds for perfumery and other purposes, because the fact that they are water soluble means that they're usually extracted and then delivered in a fat form, which is an oil. So we talk about fragrance or essential oils. The other thing you should be aware of is that what we perceive as a single plant fragrance, for example, the smell of a gardenia, actually is derived from many different volatile organic compounds combined together. So there may be several to many organic compounds in a single fragrance that we perceive. And a good example of this would be what we think of as the classic rose smell, the damask rose smell. Over 200 different volatile organic compounds have been isolated to that particular fragrance. And in the chart on the right, you can just see an array of different types of terpenes, and terpenes are the most common class or category of volatile organic compounds that contribute to plant fragrances that we perceive as nice or pleasant. There are other plant fragrances that we perceive as unpleasant, sometimes kind of funky or stinky, and those are usually other groups besides terpenes. So most of our nice smells are terpenes, and terpenes can be floral fragrances, woodsy, fruity, or resinous. Now, when I was reading about plant volatile organic compounds, I just found this amazing quote that I wanted to share from you. And this quote is from the plant ecologist Ian Baldwin. And what Baldwin wrote is that plants are champion synthetic chemists. They take advantage of their anabolic prowess to produce volatiles, which they use to protect themselves against biotic and abiotic stresses, and to provide information and potentially disinformation to mutualists and competitors alike. As transfers of information, volatiles have provided plants with solutions to the challenges associated with being rooted in the ground and immobile. So this is a lot to take in, but basically what Baldwin is saying is that plants are particularly adept at using energy to assemble fragrant molecules that they use in many different ways to navigate within their world, and that this is particularly important because unlike insects or various vertebrates or people, plants generally aren't able to move away from potential herbivores or move in response to other plants, and so they use volatile compounds as a primary medium by which they interact with their environment. Okay, so when we're talking about VOCs or volatile organic compounds, over 1,700 different compounds have been isolated from plants in 90 different families, and they continue to discover new plant VOCs all the time. And these compounds can be produced by epidermal tissues. Those are the tissues on the outer surface of the plant. You can think of it as the skin. So it's usually the upper or outer layers of the leaves, the stems, the flowers, or the fruit, sometimes the roots. They can also, the VOCs can be produced by trichomes, which are hairs or scales that grow on the epidermis of the plant. The VOCs can be produced by specialized scent-producing glands called osmophores that occur in flowers. And those osmophores can be on the petal of the flowers, the sepals on the flowers, or on the male or female reproductive organs. And then once these fragrance compounds are produced by those various tissues, they can either be released through the membranes, the outer layer of the cells of all those different tissues, or they can be released through the stomata in the leaves and the stems. And you'll remember that the stomates are those pores in photosynthetic plant tissue by which the plants are absorbing carbon dioxide and releasing water vapor. Some volatile organic compounds or precursors, like conjugates, are stored in the plant tissues ready to go. When a certain stimulus happens, then the compounds are already there and they're just released. And then other fragrance compounds are produced on demand in response to specific stimuli. And we'll talk about examples of some of the different stimuli in just a few minutes. Here we go, it's this slide. So stimuli, factors that can influence when a plant emits a fragrant or volatile compound include differences in temperature, light, the concentration of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, the availability of water, the availability of nutrients in the soil. So all of these are external stimuli that influence VOC emission by plants. And then internal factors that affect the emissions include circadian rhythms, the age of the plant, the age of an individual leaf, or the floral developmental stage. So what this means in the bottom line is that most plants don't smell all the time. They smell at specific times in response to what is going on in their environment. So if you think about a leaf, for example, a lot of leaves don't smell when you just walk by them. There's nothing volatilizing in the air, but if you damage the tissue, if you're to crush the tissue or bend or fold it, or an insect is piercing the epidermis of the tissue, then you start to get a smell. And similarly, if you think about a plant that blooms at night and is reliant on pollinators that are active at night, for example, an angel's trumpet or Brugmansia, those flowers don't smell during the day. The volatile organic compounds that give the angel trumpets its fragrance are only produced and released during the night, because it takes energy to produce them, and it's not efficient for the plant to be producing those compounds when they're not actually serving a function. Okay, so the bottom line, the big take home when we're talking about the science of plant volatiles is that what we perceive as plant fragrance is really just the tip of the iceberg. There is a whole universe of plant volatiles which we don't perceive with our very limited sense of smell, but which are transferring all this information between individual plants of the same species, between plants of different species, and between plants and other types of organisms in their environments. And basically, all of this very complex communication that is happening via volatiles is termed semiochemicals. And that word semio comes from the Greek word for sign or signal. So in other words, they are chemicals that give a signal and therefore modify the behavior of other organisms that are nearby. And semiochemicals can basically be divided into two categories. There are pheromones, which signal between organisms of the same species, or allelochemicals, which provide signals between individuals of different species. Another thing I want to tell you about plant volatiles is that they're really a very exciting frontier in the development of new techniques in dealing with plant problems in our cultivated landscapes, whether it's a commercial agricultural setting or a home garden setting. So scientists are discovering that plants have all of these weapons in plant volatiles that they are using to their defense. And now we are trying to figure out ways that we as horticulturists can capture these volatiles and use them in novel ways and in environmentally friendly ways to defend the plants from herbivorous insects, from microbial pathogens, from stresses like drought or strong sunshine, and also to use these volatiles to regulate plant growth, slow the loss of leaves, improve development, and overall improve productivity. Okay, so that's enough about the science of plant odors. Let's talk about how you would actually design an odorscape. So the first thing I want you to realize is that flowers are really the major contributors. Remember what I said about leaves, that leaves generally only release a fragrance when they are bruised or damaged. So having a lot of plants with fragrant leaves in the garden won't really perfume the environment and create an odorscape unless those leaves are constantly being brushed against or bruised or damaged. And flowers, in contrast, actually volatilize the aromatic compounds and send them at a greater distance as a form of advertising to attract pollinators. So that's why I'm saying that flowers, different species of flowering plants are really the major contributors if you want to design a fragrant landscape. And when you're selecting plants, of course, to me, any plant that smells good, I would like to have in my yard. But if you're really consciously trying to design an odorscape, you want to give some thought to selecting species or hybrids that have a particularly long blooming period or that bloom repeatedly in cycles. That way you're getting more fragrance. So when I was thinking about plants that I wanted to include in this presentation, I debated a lot about including the pinkster azalea, Rhododendron canescens, and it smells wonderful. And when it blooms in my landscape, I just love it. But honestly, it only blooms and looks good for about a week, a year. It smells wonderful, but it's not really a heavy hitter in creating an odorscape. And so although it's a worthwhile contribution, it's not something that I decided to highlight in this particular presentation because I wanted to focus on species with extended or repeated blooming periods. Also, when designing an odorscape, think about selecting different species that smell good at different times of year to create a year-round effect. So in other words, you want to have some species that smell good during the warm season, some during the cool season, and some that smell good during those shoulder seasons between the warm and cool season. When you're creating an odorscape, you're really going to get the most impact if you space those plants out so that they are not competing with one another. And it really helps to have plants positioned along the periphery of the landscape, as well as adjacent to those areas where you are most active. So the doors, the windows that you frequently have open, the carports that you come in and out of, maybe a patio entrance, the places where there's the most human activity is where you would want to position particularly fragrant plants. So I have a carport that's my main point of entry and exit from my landscape, and that's where I have multiple Brugmansias. I had a sweet almond shrub. I had other things so that every time I come and go, there's always like something sweet smelling to greet me or to send me away. Also, when you're designing an odorscape, consider circadian rhythms in floral emissions. Remember what I said, that some species just bloom and smell good at certain times of day to attract particular pollinators. So if you are mostly home during the day and you go to bed early, you would want to select species of plants that put out the fragrance during the daylight hours. And conversely, if you work during the day and you're mostly home in the evening, like me, you would want to focus on plants that smell good at dusk and in the nighttime hours, so you can enjoy those fragrances when you're in your home or garden. And then, even though I said that flowers are the major contributors, I don't want you to forget about plants with fragrant foliage. But when you place plants with fragrant foliage in the odorscape, place them in areas with particularly high traffic so that people will either brush against them or to encourage you to stop and grab a leaf and smell it. And people who have visited my garden know that I'm famous for this, that when I'm walking them around the garden, I'm always going to be grabbing a leaf and say, smell this, smell this. And so by having it in my pathways, in my high traffic areas, that encourages me to share those nice smells of these particular plants, even though if the person just walked past it, they might not perceive the odor, but you grab that leaf and crush it and give it to them, and then they go, oh, this is wonderful. Okay, so now with the remaining 15 or 20 minutes that we have left, I would like to highlight a baker's dozen of plants that meet my criterion of having repeated or extended flowering seasons, and I consider to be heavy hitters in terms of creating an odorscape in Florida. And I want to note that the plants that you would use to create a fragrant garden in Florida are really super different from the plants that you would use in other parts of the United States. So for example, there's a nursery in California that I love called Annie's Annuals, and Annie sends out a weekly email highlighting certain plants that she sells, and coincidentally, this week she sent out an email talking about plants for a fragrant garden. But since Annie's is in California, none of the plants that she highlighted as being good fragrant plants grow well here. So I have purposely selected plants that are suitable to our USDA growing zones and that adapt well to our particularly challenging Florida growing conditions. And so I felt like I just couldn't talk about fragrant plants without starting off with a rose, because roses are the classic flower that people think of when it comes to fragrance. Of course, here in Florida, because of our heat and humidity, it can be quite challenging to grow roses. So there are particular cultivars that do really well here as opposed to others. The one at the top of the slide, Louis Philippe, also known as the cracker rose, is the most famous of those well-adapted roses, but other ones that do well include the old cultivar Le Marne, Chrysler Imperial, the native species Rosa palustris, which is the swamp rose, and there are many others, but you really want to be sure of two things. And one is that there's been a lot of breeding in roses, and often roses are bred for an extended blooming time, for larger flowers, or for unique colors. And in the process of breeding to make those improvements, fragrance can get knocked out. The breeders don't always understand what genetically regulates plant fragrance, so they start messing with things to create better disease resistance and inadvertently knock out the genes that control fragrance. So a lot of the newer disease-resistant cultivars don't necessarily smell good. So for that reason, I have provided a hyperlink to a blog. Unfortunately, the Central Florida Gardener blog is no longer active, but they've kept their old posts up. And they have a particularly nice page suggesting different cultivars of roses that are both fragrant and well adapted, particularly to Central Florida growing conditions, but it applies to all of Florida. Now, another plant that I just could not leave out is the magnolia. And I don't just mean one magnolia. There are literally about 1,000 magnolia species, and many of them can be grown in Florida. This includes our native large flowered magnolia, Magnolia grandiflora, the sweet bay magnolia, so those are a couple of natives, the saucer magnolia, which those of us in the northern part of the state are familiar with, the banana shrub, which used to be included in the genus Michelia, but has now moved into magnolia. And those of you who are in the southern part of the state may know the champak or fragrant champak, Magnolia champaka. But there's many, many other examples. There are literally hundreds of different magnolias. Depending on the individual species or cultivar, they may bloom in the warm season or the cool season. The evergreen species tend to be more warm season flowers, and the deciduous species, the one that lose their leaves, often bloom on bare wood just before they leaf out. So that typically is at the end of winter, beginning of spring. Now, one thing I will say about magnolias is that many of them are prone to a type of scale known as the magnolia scale. And I think a lot of you have probably seen this on various magnolias that you're growing. And one of the best ways to avoid magnolia scale is to make sure that magnolia plants are positioned in very open areas with excellent airflow and good sun exposure. So plants that are in more crowded spaces with more limited airflow are definitely more prone to magnolia scale. And also plants that are stressed by root knot nematodes, by drought, by infertile soils are also going to be more prone to magnolia scale. So keep your magnolias happy and give them lots of room, and you're going to have less problems with magnolia scale. Okay, another plant that I could not leave out is citrus. If you are new to Florida, you may not know what us old timers know, because our citrus industry has really been impacted badly in Florida. We've had a 1-2 sucker punch over the past few decades. First citrus canker and then citrus greening disease have had a huge impact. But I remember when I first visited Florida in the 70s, in the springtime, being in a car with the windows rolled down and driving past an orchard in Central Florida and just going like, oh my God, what is that incredible smell? I was a teenager and I had grown up north. I had never smelled anything like that. And you guys know what I'm talking about. If you've been in an orchard or in a yard with a number of citrus in early spring when they're blooming, it's just almost enough to make your heart sing. I mean, talk about the way that fragrance can uplift your mood. So sadly, we don't get to enjoy quite as much of this in a commercial scale, but we can still grow citrus in a dooryard setting. I just want to encourage you to be on the lookout for the new greening or HLB resistant varieties. So there are a number of them coming down the pipes from both IFAS and the USDA. A lot of them are being released jointly. And so look for information from IFAS on varieties of citrus that are more resistant to citrus greening disease. Also, to make sure that you are discouraging the citrus psyllid that spreads that citrus greening disease. Try and plant your citrus in big, open, airy spaces with excellent airflow. So just like I was talking about with magnolias, you're going to have more problems with Asian citrus psyllids in very dense, crowded environments. And know that you're going to get not only more flowers that smell wonderful, but of course more fruit on your citrus if you follow IFAS recommendations in terms of fertilization, which are generally 3 applications of a citrus special fertilizer spaced out during the active growing season. So that's usually in spring when the danger of frost has passed, in midsummer and in fall at least 6 weeks before you're going to have your first freeze. And that's going to keep your citrus plants healthy with a lot of green leaves, which means you're going to have heavier flowering and of course then eventually more fruit. Confederate jasmine is another wonderful spring bloomer that is found throughout the state. Confederate jasmine is typically grown as a vine, but there are some cultivars that are more low growers, or if it's in an area that's open with nothing for it to climb upon, it can be trained as a ground cover. And Confederate jasmine is shade tolerant. It grows vigorously in the shade, but just be aware that you're going to get many more fragrant flowers when it is located in an open, sunny environment. The one thing you need to know about Confederate jasmine is that it is a very vigorous, fast grower. So this is not a plant for the dense, crowded landscape. It's a great plant when you've got a big open fence that you need something to climb on, or if you're planning to prune it regularly to keep under control. Tea olive is another plant that I grew up with, and where I grew up in Georgia, tea olive would form almost trees, these big, healthy, dense, free-flowering plants. And so when I first moved to Florida and I saw tea olives, I was like, what pathetic little plants. I just didn't really think that tea olive was very well adapted for Florida. But what I've learned is that they really suffer somewhat, particularly in our sandy soils. So one of the ways that we can keep tea olives happy, healthy, with dense foliage and dense flowers is to really improve our soil quality. So with fertile soil that is well mulched and has regular moisture, they tend to be much more happy. Also, in Georgia or the Carolinas, you could grow a tea olive in full sun and it would do great. But here in Florida, where the sun can really be brutal, particularly in the summertime, the tea olive appreciates some protection from that hottest afternoon sun. So a spot that receives full sun in the morning and some protection from the afternoon sun is ideal. The other thing you should know about tea olive is that typical flowering is kind of sparse, like you see in this lower left photo, but there are some new cultivars, particularly the cultivar Fodingzu, which was introduced by Nurseries Caroliniana up in Aiken, South Carolina. And Fodingzu has much denser flowers. Also, there are both orange and yellow flowered cultivars of tea olive, and they smell as wonderful as the white flowered. And tea olive is really a heavy hitter. So mine is already in bloom in Gainesville now in October, but it will continue to keep flowering through the winter and into the early spring. Gardenias. Who doesn't love a gardenia, right? I always tell people, sometimes you see dogs and they'll find a dead animal. I had a dog when we grew up, and anytime there's a dead animal, it'd want to like rub its body against that dead animal. That's the way I feel about gardenias. I could put a gardenia in my bed and just like roll around in it. They smell so good to me. And I always thought of gardenias as being strict spring bloomers. For me in Gainesville, that usually meant May into early June. But what I've learned is that there's a whole bunch of cultivars that now allow us to extend gardenia blooming season through the summer and even into fall. And depending where you are in different parts of Florida, different cultivars may be better or more poorly suited. all of the gardenias prefer acidic soils, which means for those of you in South Florida with particularly alkaline soils, yes, I see that someone's asking if tea olive also likes acidic soil. Yes, tea olive is another thing that will probably do better in a more organic acidic soil. With gardenias, they are particularly prone to root knot nematodes. So having a richer organic soil with mulch will help to discourage nematodes. And also there are a number of grafted cultivars. The one that comes to mind in particular is Miami Supreme, but there are also other grafted cultivars, and those grafted cultivars are on a species of gardenia, Gardenia thunbergia, which is more resistant to nematodes, but a byproduct is that the nematode resistant ones also tend to have a longer blooming season. Now, gardenias definitely bloom best in full sun, but when we're talking about summer blooming, May through October, you know that the Florida sun can be really brutal, and that sun is rapidly going to turn these delicate fleshy flowers from white to yellow to an almost browny orange, and as the color changes, the fragrance diminishes. So just like I said with the tea olive, positioning them where they get full sun in the morning and a little protection from the hottest afternoon sun is ideal. And 3 different cultivars that I found mentioned for extended blooming season in Florida are Daisy, which is a single flower, Frostproof, and August Beauty are all noted for having a prolonged blooming season under Florida growing conditions. The butterfly gingers, or Hedychium, is another group which does really well in Florida. These are rhizomatous or tuberous tropical plants that usually go completely dormant, so they die back in winter. They bloom best in full sun, but do appreciate a little relief from the hottest afternoon sun, particularly in summer. They're very tolerant of poor soils as long as it's well drained. So they don't like being flooded. They don't like mucky soils because that tends to rot the rhizome. So they like well-drained soils. They're okay with low fertility, but if you give a butterfly ginger compost, you fertilize it regularly, you give it regular water, watch out, it's going to reward you with flowers. And butterfly ginger is another plant that I have planted right by my carport where I enter my house every day, and it blooms in the evening, and I'm telling you, I get literally months, 4 to 6 months of fragrant pleasure out of the butterfly ginger. Murraya paniculata, orange jessamine. This is something you see most in the southern half of the state, but it can be cultivated up to zone 9. So for those of us in coastal areas further north, it will do, and even in Gainesville, down to Marion and Lake County, I see occasionally people growing Murraya in the landscape. It is frost tender, so in more northern parts of its range, it may stop or even defoliate during very coldest temperatures, whereas in South Florida, it would be evergreen and flowering throughout the year. I spent time working at the Kampong in Miami, and I can remember being there in the summer after a storm would move through, and it was almost like a trigger. It was a trigger that the stimulus of the added rainfall prompted the Murraya to release its fragrance into the air, and it would just be heady. Orange jessamine is in the same family as citrus. It's in the Rutaceae, so the fragrance is really similar and just has a wonderful perfume. Because it is in the same family, Murraya is an alternate host for the insect that carries citrus psyllid. That's the vector for citrus greening. So that means if you are already growing citrus trees in your yard, this may not be a good plant because you may be increasing the likelihood that you're attracting the citrus psyllid. Or if you're in a neighborhood where there are lots of people with dooryard citrus, Murraya probably would not be the best thing. On the other hand, if you're in a neighborhood where people are not growing citrus because they're too scared of greening disease, then this would be a nice alternative to get that wonderful citrus fragrance. And Lakeview is the cultivar that's most often mentioned as having large flowers and repeated blooming. The sweet almond shrub, it just smells fabulous year round. I had given up on it because it's got a really floppy habit and my landscape is very dense. But I've seen it really effectively trained so that it's upright as a large tree. And there's one here on the UF campus that I bike by on a daily basis. And I swear it is putting out fragrance 9 to 10 months out of the year. It is incredibly tough and drought tolerant. And it is very attractive to a wide variety of pollinators. The fragrance is just heavenly vanilla almond-like fragrance. Angel's trumpets are another great thing. There are quite a few cultivars which vary in color. Many of these cultivars are not very well suited for Florida growing conditions. So the one that you see most often is Frosty Pink, which is pictured on the right. I have some other cultivars listed that do well in Florida. All of the Angel's trumpets are heavy feeders. They love compost, mulch, good organic soils, and that helps to discourage nematodes. All of the Angel's trumpets are fragrant at night. They also can get kind of ratty over time, so they benefit from being cut down to the ground so that they can generate new growth, and they'll produce a lot more flowers with an annual pruning. Brunfelsia, yesterday, today, and tomorrow, is another wonderful example of a group of plants that have a wonderful fragrance. Up in North Florida, we just have one species, Brunfelsia australis, that you see the most, but in South Florida, there are quite a few different species, both ones that change color as the flowers mature and ones that have white tubular flowers that are wonderfully fragrant. All the Brunfelsias appreciate a good organic soil in partial sun conditions. And in South Florida, they can produce fragrance almost year round. 4 o'clocks are another example of something that I get months of smell out of. In my yard, 4 o'clocks are in bloom from May all the way through to October. They go dormant during the winter months, but return off their tuberous roots. They can be grown in full sun or part shade. They're very tolerant of poor or infertile soils, both clay and sandy soils. There's many different colors of flowers, and they put out their smell late in the day, in the late afternoon into the evening to attract sphinx moths as pollinators. But I've also noticed that late in the afternoon, they're also very attractive to hummingbirds. And then last, I just couldn't have a presentation about fragrance without ylang ylang, which those of you in South Florida are familiar with, but it can be grown up to zone 9B. So people in warmer parts of Central Florida can also grow this. This is a tropical tree from Southeast Asia with pendant branches and just an absolutely fabulous fragrance, which is the key ingredient in the perfume Chanel No. 5. And there is a dwarf form of ylang ylang called fruticosa that can be grown in a container. So it is a great way to be able to grow it in a slightly more frost prone area and get that wonderful smell, and to be able to move it or protect it just a few times during the winter month and get that amazing smell, because it is just, to me, it's one of the most wonderful aromatic plants. And I can recommend 3 books for you if you want to get more information about the science of plant fragrance or the design and selection of plants for an odorscape. And at this point, if you guys have any questions, I will be more than happy to entertain them. I think we have 10 minutes, and miraculously, I have managed to stay on time.
Yeah, very good, Mark. Right. Can you all hear me? I was muted.
I can hear
Hello?
you.
Okay. Marty, you have a question, several. Well, I was getting ready to answer this, but you may have a different. Somebody had a pH of 9 around the edge of their pool. They wanted to, they're growing gardenia hedge, and I was going to suggest to them to add sulfur to lower the pH, but they were asking if they just have to watch their shrub die slowly.
Okay, so it's not easy. What I'll tell you is sulfur doesn't stay in the soil for long, so you can be adding sulfur and sulfur and sulfur and sulfur, and during the rainy season, then it's just going to wash out really quickly. So you need to work at improving that soil. So you're going to improve your soil pH by having a good heavy organic mulch. That means not a plastic mulch, but something that is going to break down and add to the humic content of the soil. So something like pine bark. Also, if your plants really do poorly and you end up removing them, I would actually dig out the area and make sure to incorporate a lot of organic material, both partially decomposed, like chipped leaves, as well as fully broken down compost. And that's going to help you to improve the pH of the soil. Then plant your gardenias and plant them kind of low, below the level of the patio or pool deck, and then put a mulch. And that's going to help you to maintain a more acidic pH in that challenging environment.
Okay, thank you. And there's 2. One, could you put the slide back up again that has the books listed so they can see that?
Yes, I can, but this requires technological know-how.
And while you're doing that, they also someone wants to know the name of the dwarf cultivar of the last tree that you had. Was that the?
It is called Fruticosa of the ylang ylang, and I'm having a hard time sharing a screen, so I am instead going to mention that the first plant is called The Chemistry of Plants. The Chemistry of Plants, and the author's last name is Sequin, Sequin. The second book is by the noted horticultural author Ken Druce, and it is called The Sensual Garden. What I'll tell you is that Ken Druce lives in gardens in New Jersey, so a lot of his plant selections like lilacs are totally inappropriate for Florida, but he's got some good design and background information. And then the last book is really geared more to plants with smelly leaves, and it is called The Aromatherapy Garden. And the author her last name is Keville, Kedille. And I'm also, I think, going to be providing this presentation to Wendy in a PDF format that she's going to post on the conference website, so you'll be able to access it later on. Okay? More questions?
What are the blue flowers on the current slide? That last slide you had. They were like tulip cup looking flowers. I don't.
Well, they're pretty. I thought that the last plant slide that I had was ylang ylang.
Oh no, there was a beautiful. No.
It looks like it was a low growing. It looked like a perennial. Blue
Oh, that you
tulip.
saw on my desktop. Oh, that is a very freaky member of the gentian family that's unique to China. It cannot be grown in Florida. It is a fabulous species of gentian. I understand now. When I closed the PowerPoint, you could see my desktop screensaver. That's what you saw.
Okay. All
Don't
right.
try that in Florida. It will never grow here. Any other questions for me?
I'm looking quickly. It was the books and let's see, the channel. I think that was.
Section.
Pardon? Does somebody else have a comment? Nope. All right. I think that was it.
Oh, I see that Deb Walford was asking if any of these plants are invasive. I want to let you know that I actually vetted my list by going to the UF IFAS assessment, and I really wanted to talk about Cestrum nocturnum, the night blooming jessamine, but I omitted it because they say that it has a high invasion risk. So I'm a little cautious about the Confederate jasmine. I think it has the potential to become invasive in the future, though the IFAS assessment said it is not a problem. I'll also let you know that one type of angel's trumpet, Brugmansia suaveolens, is considered a potential invasion risk, but most of the cultivars that we have in Florida are not suaveolens. They are hybrids involving other species. So, so in general, in response to your question about invasive, I checked my list, and when you're selecting plants for your odorscape, I encourage you to visit the IFAS assessment to make sure that all the plants you want to grow that are fragrant are not invasive.
Okay. Good information. Okay, Mark, I think it's well, 2:59. We got a minute. Any other questions?
Can I see what's his email again?
What'd you ask?
Email.
You want
whose email? Mark's?
Yes, Mark's.
Very good. And while we're doing that, thank you all for logging on today. We want to remind you that the horticulture ID contest will be open until 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. So get on in there, click on that link in your agenda. The program will start promptly at 9:45 with Rick Shellhorn. New news is good news. But you can join. You are welcome to come in as early as 9:30 and join in the waiting room. Thank you again so much, Mark. We appreciate this presentation. We appreciate your thoughtfulness in putting it together for us and kind of how you had to go down through hundreds of plants to limit it to just a few.
I know, and I love to talk. I just think it's a miracle I got this done in an hour.
You are fabulous. Thank you.
Thank you. Everyone enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you. And his email has posted in the chat box.
Thank you.
We will see you all tomorrow.
Excellent. Lisa, if you want to stop recording and then everyone can leave meeting and then we'll be done.